practice or are you running a business? Valuation is the ultimate KPI.
Hey there, it's Mike Langford. Welcome to another episode of the Modern Financial Advisor podcast, brought to you by Truelytics, the one and only comprehensive advisor transition management platform. This week on the show, I have Gregg, the Senior Vice President and Director of Practice Management and Advisor Research from Northern Trust FlexShares ETFs with me. I invited Laura to join me on the show to discuss the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion within our industry in response to a new research report her team published titled "Diversity is Good Business for Advisory Firms: How Firm and Investor Preferences May Be at Odds." Now, at the crux of our conversation is opportunity, not just opportunity for those who we might categorize as people who should be included, but the opportunity in terms of clients and assets that are being left on the table because they're out of reach for many firms and advisors simply because of artificial limitations within their business as presently constructed. This is a powerful episode of the show, and it might just transform your business. I think you're going to get a ton out of this conversation, so buckle up for this one. Okay, but before we get to the conversation with Laura, please make sure you subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, YouTube, or wherever you like to get your podcast jam on. And if you have a question or suggestion for the show, be sure to reach out by shooting us a note at podcast@truelytics.com or use the contact form on the Truelytics site. That's what Erin Healy from Laura's team did when she reached out to suggest covering some of the report's findings on this show. I said I thought it'd be a great idea and asked her if she could hook me up with somebody at Northern Trust FlexShares to talk about it. And voila, Laura Gregg is here on the show. Speaking of Laura, let's get to the conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion right now. Let's do it. Well, Laura Gregg, so wonderful to see you today. Welcome to the Modern Financial Advisor podcast.
Mike, I am thrilled to be here, and thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure, and I am so wonderfully grateful that Erin Healy on your PR team reached out to share some of the results that you and the team at Northern Trust, the FlexShares ETF, shared and published recently. I'm like, this is fascinating. This is an area that I'm particularly interested in too, because and Truelytics, the sponsor and producer of this show, is very interested in this concept of advisor transition, right? That the advisor population is changing primarily because there's this large demographic of folks who are going to be exiting the business over the next 10 years or so, just because that's the way Father Time dictates. Right? Yeah. So we're going to see a lot of change in this industry anyway. But you're highlighting some really interesting things of changes that need to happen. So I thought maybe we'd dive in there. Why did Northern Trust FlexShares ETF decide, you know what we need to do? Let's conduct this survey on diversity and inclusion and get some data out there. Why was that important?
Well, so I will say that originally in 2018, when we were talking about doing some research, it was originally just going to be a research study on how to build advisory teams. I'd been spending a lot of time in the field and getting a lot of requests for how do we build teams. So at about that same time, I started traveling with Connie Lindsay, who's Northern Trust's head of corporate social responsibility. And she was talking a lot about DE&I, and I was talking to advisors after her sessions, and they were telling me, we really want diversity, we can't find it. And so then the light bulb went off, I should say, or on. And I realized that why don't we look at how to build teams? And as advisory firms are building teams, are they thinking about diversity as they do that? And then probably more important, what do consumers think about it? Do they care that their financial advisory firm is diverse? Is it important to them? So that was kind of the genesis for it. And layered on top of all of that, in Northern Trust DNA is diversity, equity, and inclusion. They've been making great strides for really 30 years. On this, we still have a ways to go, as I think most firms do, but it really is something that as a firm, Northern Trust and FlexShares particularly, we really embrace this. So that was kind of how it came together, and we We fielded our first survey in late 2019. We were about to bring it live in March of 2020. We even built a podcast to do it called The Flexible Advisor. We recorded a couple sessions. We were ready to go on March 20th. And then, everything changed. Oh, wow. So we thought, well, we've got to pull back. But fortunately, we had the podcast set up, started reaching out to people in the industry. How are you dealing with going remote? How is it all working? And then, ironically, towards the end of May of 2020, we decided it was time to release it, and it was released just a couple days before George Floyd was killed. So,
oh my gosh,
we got through 2020. We were heartened to have that research available. The timing was strange, to say the least. But then, after all that happened in 2020 with the global protests, I went to my boss and said, we got to do this again. We need to know if something changed.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how it all came together.
That's fascinating. And the timing, every once in a while you do some timing stuff but again, like you said, it wasn't planned, right? It just happened. Right. It was interesting, like, very coincidentally, and I don't talk a lot about the Trulytics products on this show, but they released a solution called True Continuity that they had been working on for like a year and a half, close to 2 years, but they released it right before the pandemic started. And it's this concept of like, what happens if an advisor passes away or is disabled and so forth. And all of a sudden we're hit with a global pandemic and there's this solution. It's like, and we talked a lot about that, like the timing is everything. And it sounds like you guys really nailed it here with not only, the survey and the results and so forth, but I think you took it a step further, right? You're out there evangelizing it and talking about it actively because it's important, right? It is shaping our industry. What kind of reaction did you get from the community, right? Because obviously it's a wide community with a different thoughts and so forth, and you're all over the place in terms of geographic reach. What type of feedback or thoughts did you get back from the Northern Trust community?
Yeah, well, what we found, what I've been told, I haven't done the research on it, was that there really wasn't advisor and consumer research out there on a topic like this, and so we were fortunate to have that, and the desire to talk about this was really high. I was really quite busy through all of 2020. Presenting at industry events as well as, speaking at firms and just sharing, what we knew, what we planned to do with the second survey. And I'll say one of the most humbling things for me, Mike, was when the Quad-A, the Association of African American Advisors, invited me to speak. And I was nervous, to say the least. Here I am, a middle-aged white woman, going into a group of African American advisors talking about diversity. It just felt awkward. It felt strange. But I don't know if you've ever worked with them. They are one of my favorite industry groups. They were so welcoming, and a gentleman I was working with, I expressed my feelings to him. And he said, the bottom line is we need everybody talking about this. We don't care what you look like on the outside. Yeah. The fact is we need everybody focused on this, because without everybody talking about it, no matter your role or your race or your gender or whatever, there's going to be no movement. So it was a great experience I've met a ton of people, got to speak to really fantastic groups that are pushing the needle forward.
Yeah. I think it's so important that you mentioned, getting over your own discomfort, right? And understanding that, like, listen, there are certain times when you're a little uncomfortable, and you have to recognize your discomfort is not really the issue here. That might be personal growth, right? This is about it is for all of us, right? So, well, as an example, here I am, to your point, most advisors look like me, only a little bit older, right? The average age of an advisor, we've seen the stat over and over again. It's around 60 to 62, and it's been that way for a while. So as a general profession, the advisory profession skews a little older. And they tend to be white, right? It's like, I mean, they look like me. I'm a middle-aged white guy, heterosexual, married, 2 kids. I live in a single-family home in a golf course community. That's like, if you had a vision, like, what does an advisor look like? It's probably like Mike Langford without the beard. And in my experience, I've done a lot of speaking at industry events, as you have. And when I stand up on stage, I look out in the audience. It's a dude fest, right? And the women, as an example, typically stick out. People of color typically stick out because there's so very few of them in there. And so sometimes I can imagine some folks are thinking like, well, why is it important for the industry to make this concerted effort, right? Like the industry's doing well. Like it knows it makes a lot of money. Why is it important for us to expand advisor demographics to include folks from a variety of other demographic backgrounds, whether that be race or gender or age? I think we're going to get to age a little bit in a while here. Yeah. Or, even sexual orientation, right? Expanding and being actively looking for people from the LGBTQ community and so forth. Why is that so important for people who, I guess, look like me to be willing to embrace expanding?
So, wow. I don't really know where to start with that because I've got so much to say on the topic.
Let it fly, Laura. Let it fly. Let's go. Well, as you're talking I'm an ally, right? So I'm in this and I believe this wholeheartedly. So I'm just like, let's go. Let's dive into it.
All right. Let's go. So you are right. The majority of advisors are white and they are male and they are middle-aged. However, every day that goes by, the U.S. population is looking less and less like you. Now, we just got out this 2020 census data this past spring. The white population has decreased again to, I believe, here I got a note because I want to get it right, to about 58% in 2010. For reference, it was 64%. And by 2025, whites in the U.S. are expected to represent less than 50% of the population. You're there in Austin. The Latinx population is growing. It's up to just under 19% by 2045, expected to represent a quarter. Asians were the fastest growing demographic. And then if we want to get into generational things, millennials, most educated, most diverse, until you look at Gen Z. 50% of Gen Z, or just under 50%, don't identify as white. They identify as mixed race or another race. So the demographics are changing, which is important. But then let's be honest, most of wealth ownership has been in, white men's hands. Mm-hmm. But we're also starting to see changes there. McKinsey did a great study. They released it in 2020, but in that study, they talk about wealth ownership by women. And in 2019, women controlled $10 trillion of wealth, or $11 trillion. And by 2030, so less than 9 years away, they expect that figure to grow to $30 trillion, with a T, $30 trillion. We're also seeing, there, again, huge disparity. I don't want to, come across too Pollyannish, but we are seeing the number of Black and Latino households, high net worth households, grow pretty significantly. We're seeing more and more Black and Latinos graduate from college with, professional degrees and beyond. So while our universe is mostly white and mostly male, I think we're not going to be able to effectively serve the client of the future in the same manner, because the client of the future is going to look different. And one of the things from our research, both in 2019 and 2021, is that people prefer to work with people like them, whether that's gender or culturally or whatever it is. Somebody that they feel comfortable understands their thought and how they came up and their money story.
Right.
So that's kind of what I think about that. I could go on. I'll stop.
No, we can cover so much. We're very much in the early innings of this. This is so valuable to discuss. One thing, just to kind of pick up where you were pick up what you were laying down, as I said at the end there, is that's one of the things that, folks who look like me sometimes get a little uncomfortable with. It's like, well, I'm not trying to necessarily exclude somebody. It's just I naturally have been surrounding myself with people who are like me, my like group. Like I grew up with these folks. I went to school with this person, and it was natural to work together and so forth. So it wasn't I suspect I'm right on this. It was not an active malicious pursuit of exclusion, right? For most folks, for most folks, it's just, this is the way it happened, right? So as you mentioned, the changing demographics, there was a point, 20, 30 years ago or 40 years ago, when many folks who got started in this industry, it was like, well, yeah, as you mentioned, most of the wealth was in white households. Most of the folks who came out of college were white. Most of them were male. And those who pursued this profession overwhelmingly were male. They just pursued it and so forth. So it's kind of how it wasn't like there's this evil cabal that's like, middle-aged white dudes, here we come, type of thing.
No, so, and I certainly don't ever mean to suggest that.
And the reason why I think that's important to talk about is there's a segment. It's definitely not all, but there is a segment of folks who look like me who bristle at the notion of why they need to somehow be active here, right? They will contend that, hey, I didn't do anything wrong, so why are you yelling at me about this? And I know you're not yelling. I'm just saying that they feel that, and they start to like, I don't want to be feeling guilty. I didn't do anything wrong. I just did my thing. I worked hard. And then they hear some of the stats that you're talking about, which are real and inarguable. Hey, listen, the world is shifting a little bit here, right? One thing that I think is important to say, number one, you talked about the demographics are shifting. Well, guess what? It's not that white people are vanishing. It's just that certain segments are growing faster than white segments, right? And so the proportion is changing. And it's not about you being replaced. This is about expanding the pie, right? And I think that's so important for us to talk about. And I think I want to jump into this a little deeper here. No one is saying, hey, you know what we need to do? Let's get rid of all these old white guys and get people who are completely different in here. Let's push them all out, and this will be our club now. We're taking over. That's actually not what we're saying. We're saying, hey, listen, and you hit it. People like consumers, financial consumers, want to work with some folks that look like them, that understand where they came from and so forth. We're leaving a lot of money on the table as an industry because we are not serving certain segments because you tend to work with people who look like you. So by not having as many women in your office, by not having as many people of color, right? It's not a zero-sum game.
I think you hit it on the head. If you're a white male, you have a small firm, you're comfortable with what your firm is doing today, you have an exit plan, and keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
But if you are somebody that wants to grow your business and wants to see the longevity into the next generation, then just, pure business dictates that you're going to have to make changes, just as you make changes in your technology stack. And, you have to make changes. And the reality is wealth ownership is changing and the demographics as we talked about. So if you want your firm to remain as it is and not, don't have a need to monetize it for future growth, then fine. Do your thing, enjoy your life. But, it's really a business decision. And we talk a lot about getting the next generation, right? So how do you get your clients' kids? And I think that that's going to play a big role when your clients' children or their grandchildren aren't seeing diversity. Mm-hmm. Again, they're in generations that are much more diverse than yours or mine. Yep. And I'll just share a story. A year or so ago, I was talking to a woman a very senior C-level person at a large financial services firm, and she used that firm for her wealth management for her family. And she liked the team. She wanted to make sure her kids stayed with the team. So she started including them in the semi-annual meetings when they were in high school, because she wanted them to get to know the team in hopes that they would stay. And, usually kids don't stay. So, fast forward 5-6 years, they're out of college, they've got their jobs. They did stay with the team, but ironically, each member of the family, she had 3 kids and her husband, so there were 5 of them all together. They each gravitated to a different advisor. And one of the kids gravitated to the younger advisor, another one gravitated to the black advisor on the team. But the reality is, those kids probably wouldn't have stayed if they didn't find somebody that they felt they could relate to. And so really, at the end of the day, it's putting more seats around the table and welcoming new groups of people.
Yeah. I have a semi-similar story to that. So years ago, I spoke at a conference, and I think I've told this story when it comes to niche marketing on this podcast before. I was speaking at a conference, and as I was coming off stage, this young woman approached me, and she was in one of the President's Club meetings where, you have to be making $1 million a year to be in this room, basically. And I'm looking at this woman, I'm like, man, she can't be much older than 30. And she's coming up to me to talk. She had some questions about what I had just presented. Yeah. And I was kind of excited to be able to talk to you, because I noticed as I look around the crowd, like you stuck out like a sore thumb, right? And I said, so how, tell me about building your business. And she goes, I like widows. I'm like, what? She's like, I've built my business by serving widows. And she went on to tell the story about how, like, one client just happened to come to her, like somebody referred to her, and her husband had passed away. And so she built her whole business because, these widows who from their generation had never been the ones who managed the money. Their husbands had always managed it and so forth and made the decisions. And the husband, if there was a financial advisor involved, the husband had the relationship with the advisor. She didn't. But she's built her whole business on serving widows because they can identify with her, they feel comfortable with her, and so forth. And so this is really hitting at what you're talking about, that there's this huge opportunity to expand the pie, to understand that if the demographic of your potential clients is changing, the demographic of your firm should change too. And again, that's not to say, hey, we got to kick out all the old people. It's just, well, let's talk about, like, what should we look like in the 21st century here. One thing that you brought up that I had not heard before when in our prep call, so I want to make sure we hit this, and you actually said it earlier. And I said diversity and inclusion, and you said DE&I. And during the prep call, you used a phrase, you expanded that from the acronym to be diversity, equity, and inclusion in lieu of this standard diversity and inclusion. Can you shed some light on that, on why equity deserves attention and what you mean by that? Because it actually took me by surprise, and I don't think I had actually heard the equity part before. So I want to dive into it a little more.
Okay, so thanks for saying that, because about 3 years ago, when I was traveling with Connie, who I mentioned, who's our head of corporate social responsibility, and she was talking about DE&I, we were out to dinner, and quite honestly, I didn't know her that well at the time. I was a little bit embarrassed to ask because I'd heard her presentation, 5-10 times at that point. But I had a glass of wine and got up my courage and said, okay, tell me about what this, growing up in this industry, it was diversity training first. About 10 years ago, it was diversity and inclusion training. Then all of a sudden, the equity floated in. And she said, well, I'm going to share an analogy for you. And she said, think of it as a dance. Diversity is when you get the invitation to the dance. Inclusion is when you're there and somebody taps you on the shoulder and takes you out for a spin on the dance floor. Okay. But equity is when you get to select the music that everybody's dancing to. And, that broke it down a little bit for me. But, the bottom line is, if we go back to the see it and be it, it's important for all of your employees, no matter what they look like or what their sexual orientation is or gender, to believe that they're being treated equitably, that they have a chance to grow within your firm and to make an impact. Another, Shundran Thomas, who's president of our asset management division at Northern Trust, talks about, how people will tell them and tell him, and he's very excited to hear it, that they've started a DE&I program and they're hiring a lot of young people and that have so much talent and so much potential. And he said, that's great. But, if you're not hiring anybody at any other level of your organization, what you're telling me is that you're very comfortable waiting 20 to 30 years to see that play out.
Yeah.
Because those young people can't make decisions that are going to move the needle for the business. They can help, they can grow it, but the equity thing is just, really important to Northern Trust. And so we try to always talk about it in our work.
That was such an eye-opening thing for me, the way you described it in prep, the if you're recruiting people from diverse backgrounds into your firm and they're not at a myriad of different levels in the business, right? Mm-hmm. That, if you're only coming and bringing in the young people, that you're basically telling people, this is awesome, but you can wait. That made a mark, that left a dent on me, if you will, left a mark, because I was like, oh, that's really true. That is true to think of it that way. And I had not thought of that perspective. Like, hey, listen, if you want to show your customers that you are serious about this, there have to be people in leadership positions.
Right.
Or queued up. Yeah.
At Northern Trust, we look at manager-initiated moves. And those are the moves, in a big organization where somebody taps you and says, we have this role that we're opening up. I think you'd be perfect for it. And, what you said earlier in our conversation, it's true. We're comfortable working with people like us. So I might be more inclined to tap a young female who reminds me of where I was 15, 20 years ago. You could tap a young white male. So if you've got nobody in those senior level positions that look different or are different, to tap the people that are more like them, again, it's harder to get that diversity at all levels.
Yeah. And it's gotta go back to the beginning. You gotta work on being a little bit uncomfortable, right? And I know that sounds weird, especially for those who are on the receiving end of if they're, again, don't look like me or aren't in my age bracket, to be like, what do you mean you got to work on being comfortable? I'm over here being uncomfortable. What do you stop your whining, Langford, about being, but there is an element of truth. Hey, listen, you got to stretch a little bit, right? If you may actually have to force yourself to go, okay, when I'm recruiting for this next role, I want to make sure I bring in some people from different backgrounds here. You may want to have a strategic plan and think to yourself, look at the demographics of business owners and affluent members of your community in the area that you serve as a business. And let's say you're here in Austin, Texas, as you mentioned. I'm glad you brought up my hometown here. The Hispanic population, the Latinx population is growing very rapidly here. Many of them probably own businesses. Many of them are probably very affluent and would be, if you or just looked at their financials, these are customers I want, or these are clients I want. Well, in order for you to go get them, they may have an expectation, or they would be more comfortable, and the friction would be less if you had some people from their background. From somebody who speaks Spanish, maybe, right? Or to make them feel more comfortable, or whatever it is. So you got to do the work now. You're gonna have to go through a slight bit of friction, extra friction in your hiring process or whatever before you get there. One of the things I want to cover, and so this is frankly the reason why my eyes went big when Erin reached out saying that we should get you. So she shared the survey. She's like, I think this would be a great topic for the show, right? She initially doesn't even say hey, I want you to have Laura on the show. She goes, this survey data might be really interesting for your audience. And I always put a call out to hey, if there's a topic or a guest you'd like to have on the show, please. So she sent the topic in. And this is something I've discussed with my friends and colleagues over the years. And you go, I wholeheartedly believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion are really good for business and for life as a whole. I try to stretch myself. I try to make sure that I have people who are from different backgrounds in my life and in my business. Yet I couldn't put a number on it, right? To prove objectively that diversity, equity, and inclusion are actually indeed bringing more value, right? So for the longest time, it felt kind of warm and squishy, and yeah, that makes sense. Hey, if you have more people that look differently and think differently and come from different backgrounds, you're going to have a better business. And people will be like, am I? That sounds great, but can you prove it? Like, can you give me some numbers to back? Or they just kind of shrug it off like, yeah, that sounds interesting. Wonderful. But your survey results actually do a fantastic job of adding some quantitative support for these initiatives. So I wonder if we could go through some of them. And one of them you already kind of hit on, but we can kind of jump into the numbers here. You said clients favor advisors that are like them is one of the big stats. So if we can let's get into the numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start by saying, there's been a ton of research outside of our industry. So McKinsey and Company, I would encourage everybody to go Google that. I mean, they do it year after year and year and show the business gains. But I think from an advisory standpoint, many people think, well, that's them. It's for the big companies. It's not me. I'm just, a 10-person firm in Topeka, and, it doesn't affect me. But what we found, I'll share some good news and some bad news from our 2019 versus 2021 surveys. We saw an uptick in advisors that said their firms were taking action on diversity, equity, and inclusion in 2021. I think that was 56% of advisors versus less than 50% in 2019. So love that stat. In both of those surveys, we listed 9 strategic business initiatives and asked the respondents to rank order them. And it went everywhere from building out technology through the firm to creating a value proposition beyond investment management and so on. And people can, I'm sure in the show notes, you'll show them where they can get this data. But in 2019, building diverse teams was number 8 of 9 initiatives. So after all that went on in 2020, I was certain we were going to see that climb to maybe not number 1, maybe 6, 5, if I'm really optimistic, 3. It actually fell to last place. At the same time that advisors were saying that their firms were doing more, and they are. But I think a lot of people, back to your point, don't see it. They think of this as a nice to have, a good thing to do, but not truly something that can move the business. But as we looked at our data and we broke it down to the firms that do not have a diversity program or initiative in place versus those that do, we saw some stark contrast. Those with a diversity program in place were more easily able to hire professionals, and not just diverse professionals, all professionals. Really important, they had 5-year retention rates on every measure of diversity, whether that was gender, race, LGBTQ, age. Better 5-year retention rates than their peers that did not have a diversity initiative in place. So, those, and you think the cost of replacing an employee, I mean, that can be in the thousands. Right. So those 2 things struck me. And then also, probably my favorite stat from the survey was that 55% of our respondents said that their firm or their team's culture had improved as a direct result of creating more diversity within that firm or that team. And, we talk a lot about culture in this industry and how important it is. It affects how your employees show up for work, how they treat your clients. It affects the whole word of mouth, how you're able to recruit. And, so those are just 3 stats I'll share that really get to true business benefits.
I love that. It probably stands to reason that if somebody has gone through the effort, a firm has gone through the effort, even if it's a small firm, to have a policy or to say, hey, let's talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion here at XYZ Financial. It probably means they get it, right? That they've had a bit of an awakening on some level that's like, hey, this is going to be important for us, and let's make sure we get these bases covered. Even if it's one of those where like their HR or outsourced HR firm says, hey, you should probably have something like this, just make sure you're not getting in trouble, right? Yeah. They've had to think through it, right? And making and developing an awareness sometimes is the first stage, right, of improving
right,
things.
And they're, I would say that these firms are also more forward-looking. They're much more likely to be focused on female clients or Black clients or LGBTQ clients. They've identified that not only do they need to be diverse within their staffing ranks, but that there is value, there's true business value in courting those different segments that are different from the white males that have traditionally been the cornerstone of success.
Yeah, I 100% agree. You also, second big one is female clients are a top priority. And I think you hit this at the beginning of our conversation today about, like, women are increasingly controlling more wealth. They're graduating with degrees more so than their male counterparts. So what are some of the stats you saw for women and their preferences for having advisors that look like them and so forth?
Yeah. So one big change was that women in 2021 were 5 times as more likely to work with a female advisor. That was up from 4 times as likely in 2019. And just that, we've done, and I'm going to cite some stats from a different research study that we did.
Sure.
In 2019 on high net worth primary breadwinners. But we looked at primary breadwinners, male and female, in 2019, and tried to get an understanding of the differences of their wealth management experience, and really bust a lot of stereotypes. The stereotype that women are afraid of risk. And in our research of not all women, but the high net worth primary breadwinners, they're not afraid of risk. In fact, as we had the men and the women talk about their risk tolerance, the men were more likely to consider themselves conservative investors than the women. There's a lot of things that go on. Also, the stat that women will leave their advisor after the death or divorce of a spouse. And again, for these women, they probably had they were much less likely to leave their advisor than their male counterparts, but they probably also had a hand in selecting that advisor. So as we see that wealth ownership change and shift over to more women, those women are going to be hiring advisors, and they're probably going to be more loyal to the advisors that they hire. So, again, we really encourage everybody to reach out to women and treat them the way you would treat, any client,
right?
And not.
It seems so just basic and logical, right? It's just like it just seems so like in your face obvious, right? So I think everybody, can admit, we see way more women in senior leadership roles at large companies, small companies. We see way more women business owners today than we did in generations past. We are also seeing, as you said, lead breadwinner in homes. I know I have several women in my life where I know they make considerably more money than their husbands do. I know situations where the husband has stayed home with the children because the wife in that relationship is just making way more money, and it makes sense for her to be crushing it out there versus him going out on the work rest, so he'll stay home. And I know also many women who are rolling solo, right? They've chosen not to get married, and they are doing very well in their careers, and so to ignore them or to assume that they're just going to fit into your model where it's an all male advisory firm, probably not the smartest idea. Like, you want to track some of these people.
So I'll share a story. So this is 2018. So, a little bit of time has gone by, but not really all that much. My husband and I were looking for an advisor. I got names of people that came highly recommended, called in advance, let them know, been in the industry for 25 years, my Series 7 for 25 years, been managing our investments on my own, but it's past time.
Yeah.
And it still happened. We would go in to meet with these male advisors, and the conversation would be with my husband, about his golf game. Oh, you golfed at St. Andrews. That's really cool, blah, 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 blah. And one even in particular wanted, I told him I worked for FlexShares ETFs. Now, do you know what an exchange-traded fund is, Laura?
Are you serious?
I mean, you can't make this up.
That is brutal.
So it still exists, and my caution to everybody is go in with an open mind. Don't assume it's going to go one way or the other, because you never know who you're going to have.
That is, oh my God, that is brutal. I'm sorry I had to go through that. That is nuts. It's just, I was thinking,
that one I just got up and left.
Yeah, I would imagine so. But I might have dropped a couple of F-bombs and some other things on my way out the door if I were you. That is crazy. You hit on some other things. I just want to make sure we talk on this. You talked about recruitment and culture at the firm a few minutes back. I wanted to dive back into that a bit, because I've done a couple of blog posts and recorded a couple of podcasts on this topic, and I think it's really important too. Like I routinely say, and I wholeheartedly believe this, we still have a war for talent, right? If you were building an organization and you were trying to grow that organization, make it a long-lasting organization that competes heavily, talent matters. Recruiting the best people you can get into your firm absolutely matters. And good people have choices, right? They're always going to have the ability to go, you know what, that place over there is way better than this place. And oh, by the way, living here in Austin's awesome, but now I'm moving to a different city or whatever. So good people are always going to have choices. And if you want to be a really vibrant, profitable firm, you're going to have to recruit them. You're going to have to keep them. And, I know a lot of my people who look like me and in my general age bracket are going to start rolling their eyes a little bit when I mention that the war for millennial talent is going to be very important. And millennials aren't teenagers anymore. Just so you know, memo, the older age bracket of millennials are in their 30s now.
Turning
not only
40.
Are they starting to, right? So the millennials are no longer little kids. Just, so when you're out there using your little millennials, just so you know, they are functioning adults with families and earning, well, and they're highly educated folks, but they are much more attuned to these things that you're talking about. They want to work for firms that have diverse. And, the next generation you're coming up, the Gen Z generation, which I don't know when that starts or whatever, but I'll use my son who's 16, junior in high school. Mm-hmm. That dude is not going to tolerate just a firm that's filled with just a bunch of white dudes, right? Just I'm letting you know, put you on blast right now. My son and my daughter, who will be adults before you know it, and flash forward 10 years, they'll be looking to work at good firms like whatever. They want this type of stuff. What have you seen in terms of the recruiting efforts and how important it is to candidates? Have you seen any data there that kind of backs up what I'm selling here?
So I'll say that, as it relates to millennials, and so I've got, a 21-year-old is my oldest. He's Gen Z. So they're coming fast.
Yeah.
Out of college. But it's not just the work they're looking for. They want to be associated with organizations that they can be proud of. I mean, I think we probably all do to a certain extent, but, I know of one young man who, great advisor. He's probably, 32, 33. He left a firm because they wouldn't embrace ESG. He wanted to include that in portfolios. They wouldn't do that to the extent that he wanted it. But, on the recruiting path, as we talk about diversity of all types, we're still hearing, I really want diversity. Diversity is very important, all kinds of diversity. But when we post a job, nobody diverse ever applies. So what can I do? But, our data shows us that 61% of advisors, are still recruiting from their personal and social networks. Even in the big wires, where they've made a huge investment in DE&I across the board, especially in HR, to help you. They're still first going to their personal social networks. That's not going to lead to diversity. Yeah. And also, I would say to those people that are throwing their hands up in the air is, if it were anything else, you'd change your process, right? If you keep doing something a certain way and it doesn't yield the outcomes you say you're looking for, then you change how you're doing it. So get away from the personal networks. Start getting to know the CFP directors at the universities across the country. I think, Mike, one of the greatest things that happened with COVID is that it, for once and for all, and I've been a hybrid worker for 21 years now, it's shown us that you can be productive, you can contribute remotely, and it's knocked down those geographic barriers.
Yeah.
So now you have access to talent from everywhere.
Yeah.
If you can get on board with hiring remote people. And I think, a year and a half into this pandemic, we see that it works. So I would really urge people to look outside of your local community if you can't find diverse hires, but also, be active in the local universities. Be active in the affinity groups like, Quad A.
Yeah.
Or women's affinity groups. You can find talent there. Get involved in your own community and organizations that have members that maybe don't look like you, and then take the time to get to know them. There's another great organization called the Mom Project, and they're still fairly new, but they're doing work with Accenture. Their whole goal is to find jobs for women that may have left the workforce for a little bit to raise their family. There you can get talent and experience. So there's a lot of different ways you can do it. It's hard, but it's not rocket science. Yeah. If you want to do it, you can.
I'm reminded of, you just reminded me, I saw an interview on one of those talk shows, 60 Minutes or Daylight. They were talking to women, professional women, who had taken a mid-career break because they had children, right? So that, maybe these women were in their early 30s or late 20s or whatever, and they were crushing it in their jobs, and they took a block of time off, be it 5 years, 10 years, or whatever, because they wanted to be home in the early years of their kids. And then when the kids got to a kind of escape velocity age, whatever that may be, they wanted to return to the workforce, and they were having a challenge getting back into the workforce at the levels they left. And the like, and this is years ago. So this is pre, remote work being as common as it is. And one of the women said, listen, the notion of coming out of college, right out of college, getting a job and working straight for 40 years without ever taking a break, and then stopping working and living your old years and maybe dying 15 years later, that is a notion that only men could think of, right? And she was being somewhat sarcastic and tongue-in-cheek about it, but it is kind of a weird concept. Like, look, you're going to, as you say, like, reach into different pockets of people. One of the things that I found helpful for me, and this is my own personal growth that I'm willing to share, is like, I find it's really helpful to just be interested in people. And that's a good trait for every financial advisor. If you're sitting down with your client, be interested in them and be curious, constantly ask probing questions to learn more about them. Be open to when you meet somebody who doesn't look like you or is from a different background or what have you, to just kind of ask them some questions, get to know them, ask them more about them. And what you'll find is you will expand your thought process a little bit about, like, who do I want to surround myself with? Oh, how might I use this talent? What other opportunities am I missing? I mean, that's what we're talking about here, right? I think is, how do we seize more opportunities? We are missing so much by not including folks. Not, you know what I'm saying?
And I would say, to build on that. Now, I'm somebody that didn't leave the workforce, so I'm going to be that 40-year person, but that worked for me. So far it's worked for me. But I have a nephew who is, I think he's turning 40, he's millennial, and by every millennial stereotype, he checks the box. But he and his wife, they work in 5-year increments, and then they take a year off.
Well, that's interesting.
And they go, and they're very philanthropic minded people, and they go and they start a charity, Like they just got back from Portland a couple years ago, where they spent a year starting a charity there and getting it off the ground. And then they came back and found different jobs and are working. And so I think it's not just a woman thing. I think people are viewing, you only have so many years in your lifetime, and different people want to spend them differently.
Yeah. No, it's 100% true. I mean, I'll just tee myself up. You know, I work from home, right? Like I've done so like you. I've done it for 13, 14. Well, yeah, maybe 14 years, right? It was, my son was really little when I decided to start working from home, and I wouldn't trade it for anything, right? I got to be home while my kids were little, and you drop them off to school and be home when they get home and so forth. And now that they're reaching the ages where like, they don't really care if dad's home. I'm thinking like maybe we get an office and expand some things in a little bit different way. We've got a fully remote team, but no, I 100% agree with you. To kind of close things out here. During our prep call, we were having this great conversation, and I said something like, financial consumers, of course, they want to work with other advisors who look like them. This just seems easy. Like, be open-minded, bring some people. And I love the fact that you're like, nope, it's hard, dude.
I think what you said, and I did interrupt you while you were saying
I loved it.
Was, how hard can it be? Just, hire a couple people that don't look like you.
Yeah.
And and I was like, oh, time out there. And that, and that's where it really gets to that inclusion part of it, Mike, because, we talked about if you just hire young people and all that, but if you hire people and then they don't feel included, they're not going to stay. And so then you're adding to the narrative that I hire diverse people, but diverse people never stay. Well, you want to stay in a place that makes you feel comfortable. And we had a guy, a DE&I strategist, Kemi Joseph, on our Flexible Advisor podcast, and he talked about how important it was before you dive into a DE&I program is to take a look at your current culture. Talk to the people that are on your team. Tell them you're going to start, this diversity program. Find out how they're feeling, where they are, what their concerns are. And then as you go through that hiring process, you need to bring in people that are going to be a cultural fit, even if they look different or have different sexual orientation. But everybody needs to be on board for it to really work. And the people at your firm need to understand that it's a good business decision. And if they want to stay at the firm, it's going to benefit them. And it's a great social decision. We all know that. But the inclusion is so I was talking to head of a private equity firm not too long ago, and he was going through the same thing. Nobody diverse ever replies, and then they don't stay. And I'm like, well, what are you doing about inclusion? He's like, well, we take them out to golf with us. I'm like, oh, Joe, it's more than an occasional game of golf. It's how do they, is there a career path? Are they seeing people that look like them? Are you giving them opportunities to join affinity groups where within the industry where they can learn from others that have shared backgrounds? But yeah, the inclusion part is key.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree, and I'm so grateful, and I say this all the time because as a father, as a daughter, and it just the way that I grew up is there's a lot of people weren't as open-minded, let's put it that way, or thinking that way. And then I look at my own family life and my own work life and how much progress we've made. I'm so heartened, to see it, but I am fully aware that we have a lot more work to do. And I'm so grateful that you and the team there at Northern Trust are kind of actively pushing this thing forward. And I'm grateful to Erin, I think is listening in on us while we're talking. This is awesome. I'm like, hi, Erin. You can't see, we can't hear you, but I know you're there. So grateful that she put us together. So thank you very much, Laura. What is the best way for somebody to follow up with you and learn more or kind of pick your brain on if they've got questions about doing these programs at their firm? What's the best way for people to get in touch?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And I would love to speak to anybody that's interested in talking about this. As you can tell, it's a passion for me. But we have a website where you can, we've got I think 10, 12 podcasts out there on the website, our research paper and some other things. And that is go.flexshares.com/diversity. You can find me on LinkedIn, Laura Hanachek Gregg, and, just happy to speak to anybody about this because we really all have to work together to move the needle.
Perfect. This is wonderful. We'll make sure to get all that stuff linked up in the show notes. Well, Laura, Gregg, it's been wonderful having you. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much for listening to and or watching this episode of the Modern Financial Advisor podcast. It's always great to have you with us. Huge thanks to Laura Gregg for sharing the amazing insights that she and the Northern Trust FlexShares team surfaced in their research report. This is such an important topic for your business, regardless of your size or stage of business. The modern financial advisory firm really needs to invest in diversity, equity, and inclusion if you want to be competitive in modern America, right? Just is what it is, all right? So do yourself a favor, make sure you download the report and give it a read. There's a lot more insights and learnings in there than we covered on this show. We've linked it up over on blog.truelytics.com to make it really easy for you to find and download. So just head on over there, find this episode of the show, click download, all good stuff, all right? That's all I have for you today. Please do stay safe and be nice to each other. We'll see you next time on the Modern Financial Advisor podcast. See ya. Bye.